And thanks to Walmer Yard and Baylight Foundation and Laura Mark for this incredible collaboration. And also Peter Salter, who is the architect of these 4 interlocked houses that we will have the chance to walk around after the conversation is with us. So actually he will be maybe taking some of the groups through the houses, and if you have burning questions, we have Miroslaw Balka, the internationally acclaimed artist who has widely shown in the UK and Europe and beyond, and he's also in town for his solo exhibition at White Cube opening tomorrow. So we thought that will be a really exciting opportunity to get him and ask him our burning questions. But also at the same time, we thought Walmer Yard is quite an interesting setting to have a conversation with you tonight. And before we start, I'm Foto Justek. I'm the director and chief curator of DRAF, David Roberts Art Foundation, and my colleague.
Hello everyone, I'm Marlies Augustijn and I'm the assistant curator at DRAF. DRAF has a tradition and a history of researching specific works in the David Roberts collection. This is called the Study Series, and I'm currently looking into one of Miroslav's works, which was also one of the reasons we wanted to host this conversation tonight. So one of his works in the David Roberts collection is Zoo Tea, which you can see on a postcard. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here tonight and to hear more about Miroslav and his practice, also to feed us into the study that I will be writing.
Mm-hmm. So the outline of our evening is we will have 40-45 minutes of conversation with Miroslav, and afterwards we will open the floor for questions. And as you may all know, oh yeah, and we have
like questions.
no questions. We actually have the pleasure of hosting Miroslav's young son with us tonight. He's the youngest audience member in the room. And we are also, and yes, Kasia, his mother, and we are also broadcasting this event. So it's and as you know, we are also documenting. If you have any concerns of being in the photographic documentation, please let us know after the event. So Miroslav, thank you so much for coming today. And
my pleasure. Thank you very much. It was a beautiful moment before we start to talk, it was a moment of silence. So I feel a little bit like on the private mess somewhere, you know, like in Christiania in Copenhagen or somewhere in the almost hippie context. Also, this architecture context also brings me to thinking about the kind of the fairy tale or something unreal where we are here in this space. So thank you for inviting me to such a intriguing interior and architecture.
No, it's really a pleasure. And I mean, like, to give a further context to Walmer Yard, it was designed and crafted by architect Peter Salter, and we thought immediately that you both have an interest in human presence. So Peter Salter, in his architectural drawings, we also had some of the book here, that he inserts human sketches into the designs, the architectural drawings of the houses or buildings that he imagines. But these drawings or these insertions are almost like projecting a future, a life that will foster in those dwellings, and we thought it's also quite interesting juxtaposed to your artistic practice, where many of your works are actually composed of traces or accumulate resonances of people in their absence.
Yes.
Could you perhaps talk a bit more about the urgency of talking about the human element in your work without the humans?
Well, you know, the works which for some of my years of my artistic practice at the beginning, I started with quite of the academic education, I don't know if it means good or bad, but at least I can make a sculptures by my hands. By sculpture, when I left academy, we understood the figure, human figure, because it was no other perspective of understanding sculpture in the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw in 1985 than figurative sculpture. But then after 5 years of my experience with the body, which was experience of deconstruction of the body, and a very good example of this deconstruction is the work which is at the collection of the Tate Modern, which is the work titled Fireplace. When I notice how important elements of the sculpture are the elements different than the figure, and like the base for the sculpture. And for example, in this mentioned sculpture, the base for the situation, visual situation, was the carpet, which was upside down, and it was in the relation with what is under the carpet. So it were a lot of private discoveries, and I make the research how to replace the figure, how to replace the body, and the best I found that the best, and this is something real element of sculpture which can replace our body, or that our body can be connected with, is the coffin or the urn, because the dimensions of the body have to fix the coffin. So in my works between 89 and 90, I started to, instead of showing body, I started to show the shapes related to the body. And slowly, step by step, I noticed that to talk about human body, I don't have to reproduce the human body in the space. And it was a process of different spaces, different elements of architecture, like corridors, were important statement for me. And finally I came to the idea that the human body returned to my works in the figure of visitor, because finally the space, even with very minimal artistic gestures, which are mind gestures, recognizable mind gestures, but there is always, they don't exist without the presence of the visitor, and the visitor is taking the role of the figurative sculpture in the space, and this is a very performative experience. So I think that after so many years I understood that the figure, it's still representative in the exhibition, because without the visitor, exhibition would be dead. More or less, just. So if you give me another question, because otherwise
No, but it's all no, but it's also about like art, you know, what would happen to art as well if it's not visible, isn't it, in a way? Like it becomes art also when the artist creates it, but then when it is widely shared with publics, then it actually gains its whole weight in a way, or meaning.
Yeah, but you know, visual art is not any longer about only seeing. You know, it's about dealing with all senses, and for me, the senses, the smell, you know, the temperature, the touch of the work, they are important part of my artistic practice. So through my experience, I noticed that seeing is just the past, you know, you could experience the works of art just only by seeing. However, also you make the performative gesture towards the painting or sculpture of Michelangelo. It was a performative gesture because your body was confronted with the naked body of Pieta Rondanini, which was destructive body almost, or the aerial Pietas, or so it's always this. It was a performative gestures because we always have the performative experience. Now we can give the name to this. Before we did things without the knowledge. Even standing in the front of William Turner, it was kind of the performative gesture because another person could see you standing in the front of Turner, and then you could have experience of Caspar David Friedrich, for example, once you saw the figure standing in front of the landscape. So.
Yeah, there's an immense spatial relationship as well, frame within a frame. Yeah.
So.
You also mentioned the coffin and tunnels and confined space being a big part of your practice. And we're sitting here in front of the image of your house and studio in Poland. And I think in many of your interviews you mentioned the significance of this house and the place where you grew up. You lived very closely with your family in quite a small space, and which I think resulted in many of these works where you reference confined spaces. And this makes me wonder what would your practice look like if you wouldn't still live in Poland, if you would have left earlier there. And yeah, so basically how big is the significance of you staying there and still living in the house you grew up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where I would be if I wouldn't work in this house, but because it's very impossible to answer for the question like this, because artistic practice is life practice, so you cannot separate these two. They are not separated paths. You know, my life is my art, my art is my life. So, but for me, when I got this house, which was built in 1935 by my grandfather, when I got the possibility, when nobody lived any longer in this house in 1993, I think it changed my artistic practice very much. You know, when I could start to work in the places which were carrying the memory of me living there or my family living there, so it was a very important moment. However, before I experienced a little bit such a moment when I made my diploma work in 1985, when I brought the sculpture. It was a very important sculpture called Remembrance of the First Holy Communion. When I brought this sculpture into the context of the abandoned house somewhere in Poland, near Warsaw, in the small village. And I exhibited this work there, and we brought it was my diploma, so we brought all the commission to the site, you know, and I understood a little bit at that time that how important is the how context of the place where you display the work can have such a strong relation with the work by itself. And then, but this is the space which interested me. And
He's silent now, actually.
yeah, but yesterday I have a feeling that he speaks English. So it was a moment when, coming back to 1985, when I noticed that all the structure of knowledge, which was representative for my professors, just fall down, being confronted with the situation out of academy. So I noticed that so reflection came to me that maybe the work of art should be constructed in this way that can live also outside of the academy or outside of my studio. So that I should look for different context, and that this context is very important. So when I moved in 1993 to this house, when it was just empty rooms with the furnitures, very clean, because my mother always put a lot of attention to this kind of the discipline of the space. And for the first year I was afraid of doing anything, not to dirty the space. Because, and then slowly I moved one bed out, I took it away because I needed the place. But because my parents lived next house to it, so I was a little bit, I didn't know if I can, what I can, what I can't. And then finally it ended after many years into the very dirty place. But by dirty, I mean that it is carrying a lot of traces of my work. But just to change the house where I grew up into the place where I'm working, it was not easy process, it took me time. So but this was also the lesson of when I activated my memories, and then of people living there, and it was a very strong impact on my art. And probably it was a moment when I went, instead of going this way, I went that way, and that's like it was like the big stone in the riverbed, and I had to go one way, not the other way. So I don't know where I would be if not this experience. But this is, unfortunately, we have one life so far, and then
to find out.
find out. But even the fact of the limits was very important for me, which is quite. Is visible in my art, the limits and the limits of the dimensions. Working in this house, I couldn't make something what will be bigger than the size of the window or the door when I had to take it out. And very often I had to take works out through this window, because this was the most of the works I welded in this space. So it was like the gesture of taking the crate out of the window. It reminded me, as I remember, how the coffin with the body of my grandfather was taken from the house. So it is a lot of relation when life meets art in the most unexpected place, moments.
But also, I feel, or we could observe that one of the other threads to your work that this house brought is the restriction of materials, in a way that the kind of minimalism that you employ in your practice. I mean, it does resonate with this house as well. Like, for instance, when Peter Salter was conceiving the understanding of the house, he centralized on 4 materials: concrete, steel, wood and clay. And for your work there's also a kind of refined minimalism, but it's also in a way that refinement is not a representational refinement, but it's almost like a transformation of taking it to another place where it is related to your immediate personal life, but somehow the works have a life on their own.
Yeah, but what is important for me in artistic practice is listening to the place where I work as well. So many inspiration to my works came from the process of listening to the house. Like, for example, my works with ashes, for example, came from the everyday process of heating the house with the coal, which I had to warm up the studio every day because I didn't live there, so I came in the morning The studio was winters,
Freezing.
winters in Poland are colder than here. So first I had to spend 1 hour on warming the space with the coal, but then it was a natural process. So I had more time. At that time, when I was younger, our times shrink very much, but at that time I had the time. But then I was confronted with a big amount of ash. So I collected this ash. I didn't throw it away. And then I made very beautiful, isn't it?
Extremely beautiful.
Extremely beautiful works using this ash in such a minimal, abstract way, like the room which was covered with the thin layer of ash. Every wall was covered with ash till the height of 2 meters 50, which is the dimension which I always very often use, because this is as much as I can reach, because I use the dimension of the bodies, my height and my reach of the arms. And so it was just the empty space, the walls were covered with ash, and that's it. And so this was a trace of the heat in some way. So ash was the trace of the heat. So I'm very much interested in my art, in the traces we are leaving, like the first inspiration to another beautiful work which was shown last summer at the White Cube example, the column made of the pieces of the soaps. The inspiration for this piece came from the box with the used pieces of soap collected by my grandmother, because she and her daughter, my mother, and my father, it were the generations who took care of every little bits and piece. They didn't throw things away. Being not trained with recycling, they made natural recycling, which came from life. So this was the first inspiration when I saw this collection of these used pieces of soap collected by my grandmother. I turn it to, again, very minimal gesture, which can be related with the endless column of Konstantin Brancusi. So for me, quite important part of my practice became how can I show something which comes from the ordinary life, something which is a trace, like these used pieces of soap, a trace of washing hands, and it's an element of the hygiene at home. How can I transform them? How can I make them beautiful in some way? Because I'm working with materials like old rubber balls, rusted steel plates, almost eaten by the worms, wooden planks. But I have a feeling that I'm talking about the beauty, and I'm not afraid this word, of this word. So, because this is a possibility of the gesture of artist, that also I can change their lives, because these little pieces of soap, they can be thrown away, but very often I'm just, as I said before, I'm listening to, but also I'm looking under my feet. So I don't kick away the things which lies on my road, but I'm picking them up, and then I'm trying to change their lives, and I'm looking for a new lives for them, and it's like process of being an artist. I can bring the dignity to the thrown objects. So it's just like there are famous photos of Samuel Beckett, for example, sitting on the garbage cans or garbage bags full of garbage. My gesture is I'm not only sitting on this garbage, I just open this bags with the garbage and I'm looking for a goods which I can transform into the objects of desire, aesthetic desire. Because this is what Picasso started with all the Cubist movements, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, when the ordinary objects, the scrap of newspaper, anything which you can pick up from the floor, turn to the objects of art. And this, before you had to paint it or make a sculpture from the material which is not present by itself, you know, in the nature, like bronze, and that you had to change the shape of the stone. And later, from the beginning of the 20th century, the artists started to use the ordinary objects, and I think I'm continuing in some way the practice of this artist. You know, the artist like Kurt Schwitters, for example. You know, my studio now looks like the Merzbau, but in horizontal. You know, so.
This also kind of reminds me of an interview where you go around your house and talk a bit more about certain traces that have been left. One of them being from your grandmother, who was praying on the ground and touched the ground, and you can still see that mark on the floor. And I think this clearly shows your real engagement and the importance you give to traces left by people. And these things are very much from your personal memory, I think, but there's also works such as the Zoo Tea piece, where you really represent a more collective memory and a bigger trauma. This work in particular is about, refers to the concentration camp, Treblinka, where one of the guards built a zoo for his children, for entertainment. And Miroslav,
not for the children. Not for the children. The zoo was built for the guards, just to have fun.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, it was this place of fun in a really horrible environment where thousands of people died. And so I wonder how do you go about transforming these kind of traumas into a piece?
I mean, maybe the piece, I transform them into the piece. I transform war into the piece.
Yes.
No, but I think that my stone was thrown into this water of the place which is called Otwock, where the house is. And my artistic activity, the circles of my artistic activity are like the ripples across the water. So once I was dropped, it happened like this. So the first ripple was the ripple of childhood. Then it was wider for the memory of my family living there. And then suddenly I noticed the ripple of Holocaust, which took place in the territorium of East and Central Europe, and the city where I grew up was a part of the Holocaust. You know, 8,000 of Jews were sent from the city of Otwock to Treblinka, and for many years the history in Poland in the communist time, like the history in all of these communist countries, was far away from the truth. And when the information was very limited, so I got the serious information about the real how the Holocaust, real image of the Holocaust, quite late, when I was already 30-something. So, I mean, I knew that it was a Holocaust, but the literature didn't cover the local context. You know, it was general Holocaust, so you knew that Holocaust was in Auschwitz and
Outside.
outside,
but not,
but not so close. But I noticed that I lived one street away from the former border of ghetto in Otwock, which covered much more territory than the rest of the city, because 75% of the citizens of the city were the Jews. So you can imagine when you start to think about situation when one day 8,000 people is taken away, and then how empty from one day to another, how empty the place is. It's more than half of the people disappear. So dealing with this subject of when I started to think, I started to read, I started to study even the subject of Holocaust. I slowly, step by step, I feel the responsibility for the history. So I wanted to fill the gaps in the memory with my works. So So I started my travels to the death camps, to Treblinka, to the other ones, and it was my kind of the pilgrimage. And then I made quite a lot of video works related with the places, but very often these are the places where you don't have any trace of the death camps, because all the death camps were erased after serving for 1 year, killing the thousands of hundreds, thousands of people, and then they will be taken away. But I visited these places, and then finally I found that this is also my task as an artist to say something about that time, and how to. I started to think how I can transform. What are the words I can use talking about such a important subject like Holocaust? Because the shadow which was generated by Adorno just in 1948 after the war, that the artist shouldn't make any works after Holocaust, you know. The shadow was quite long, because even now, you know, if you are allowed to make the work which is related with the subject or not. And I think that as Paul Celan used to break the language of his poetry to constructed the new words, new context of the words, and talk about Holocaust, but not necessarily about the experience of camp, because he wasn't in the camp, but creating the shadows, which can be very strong and different length. And I think that I also tried to, actually Paul Celan didn't finish well his life, yes, he committed suicide in 1971, but for me, in one moment of my life, I found, of course it was not just from day to another day, but I found that I should say something as an artist, and then some of my works get closer relation to the Holocaust. One of this work is the mentioned by you, the zoo tea, which, and I noticed that to talk also about the trauma of Holocaust, you can even talk about the zoological garden, which was built on the area of the camp, and so.
Yeah, but I think it's also in a way excavating a past that is quite pierced with atrocity. Is a heavy task, and you know, like, yes, you mentioned Adorno, but for instance, Walter Sebald also says that, you know, to actually, because he hasn't directly experienced the Holocaust, he was one of the survivors, but he says you need 2 generations to die like after that traumatic event, and whatever traumatic event that is in history, in order to start talking about it. And actually, if we think about today, there's so many traumatic events are in continuum. They're continuously taking place in different parts of the world, like from the refugee crisis to ongoing wars, or civil wars taking part in many parts of the world today, and it is very important, and I feel that you also as an artist feel the responsibility to bring those issues to be experienced. I mean, for me, one of the very strongest experiences of your work was at the Turbine Hall in 2009 when you had the commission, and to climb the ramp and to walk into that pitch dark container with other people was quite strong and unsettling, and of course then it really opens up to projecting to many things, from those like kind of showers that many of the Jews were sent to at the concentration camps, to many other places of violence. But then, I mean, there was, I don't know, like I always we were discussing with Marlies before as well, because I still feel like there's somewhere hope embedded in your works, but when you talk about them, it's mostly the dark side comes forward. But what would you say?
No, there's always the hope in each of my work.
Yes, thank you.
No, because for example, and it's related with different gestures, because for example, once being at this big steel box titled "How It Is,"
exactly.
at the Tate.
Yeah.
If you turn your body 180 degrees, you saw the light at the end, at the entrance. So it was a hope. Yeah, it was just you have to look back. Or it was in the work mentioned before, Zuti. This element of warming the situation was this naked electric bulb, which was fixed at the top of the sculpture. So it was just the light of hope, So they are the moments. There's the element of the hope, which you, once you will come tomorrow to see my exhibition at the Tate. At White Cube, you will also see that there is an element of hope in the works. I'm not going to tell you what is this, but because with the hope is like with everything in life, the hope is different for everybody. Yeah, so it's no one general hope. There are the different hopes, and they are very private hopes often, and they don't have to have dimensions of huge dimensions. There's a little light which can change your perception of seeing, of being as well. So.
But then I do feel that there is, for example, with the light, there is often a suggestion of light and warmth, but then once you get closer, that kind of disappears. And there's one work where that's really apparent, where there's a light and you enter the work and it goes off. So then we were discussing this, if there is hope, and to me it then felt like the hope definitely doesn't prevail. It's not. It's not as prominent as Pater's experienced it, actually. And what do you think? What would you like people to take away from your work?
Said, to fail better.
Yeah.
And how he said?
To fail better.
To fail again. To fail better.
Yeah.
So there's an element of hope in failing as well. So the practice of failing. No, but I like this game between light and darkness. You know, the work which you mentioned, which was called Shining Corridor, which was named by the child of the collector who bought the piece. Like this, but oh, this is very shy sculpture, because the concept of the sculpture was that it was like the small corridor closed from one side, and once you saw the light through the gaps in the planks which build the corridor, but when you come to the opening of this corridor, the light was off, so you seeing the light, seeing the hope, finally you've been confronted with the situation when it's switched off and it's not for you, it's dark. But when you waited quiet, not moving the body for 1 minute, the light came, but nobody did it because we are running too fast nowadays. So it's also about the time, because I think time is very important, especially, it was always important element of the perception of work of art, or element of life. You know, if we don't give time to our life, to the art of the others, we are just runners, you know, and we don't know directions where we have to run. We just run like rabbits, and then if you stop the person and you ask where you run, and say, I'm running because I am born to run. Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually a poet, a Turkish poet, who said the rabbit doesn't run because it's afraid, but it gets afraid because it's running. Yeah, I couldn't translate it better, but actually that is a very important element to your work, because I think that's kind of like almost your subliminal expectation from the audiences, that space of contemplation, of pose. And also, like you mentioned, Beckett a lot, and he is also an incredible writer, but he basically writes really good poses between words where the narrative kind of like infiltrates into concrete, solid form. What is it that you need from those spaces? Like, yeah, of course, in one way you said we're in a very fast-paced environment, that everything is happening so fast, and we're also, you know, we're also criticizing it, that we're bombarded by images every day, or there's so many things to do in our life that it's like basically we are doers more than beings. Is this perhaps something that you want to kind of convey with your works, where people, like for instance, even your show opening tomorrow, there's an immediate thing to collect. I'm not going to reveal anything, so you have to go. There's an immediate experience, but actually the experience starts unfolding and starts boiling as you keep staying.
Yeah, I mean, keep staying. I mean, there is no meditation if you don't stop. And for me, the experience, I mean, of work of art also related with the kind of the meditation, you know. So many people practice yoga. They carry mats to the spaces, and we can recognize them on the street, but they are practicing yoga. But I don't know if they practice yoga out of the places where they practice yoga, because yoga is about the practice, you know. So I'm a little bit trying to build this meditation situation, because I think that my responsibility as an artist, when I exhibit in the institutions, galleries, museums, it's to make something different than everyday life. You know, that's why I'm not very much related with pop culture. I mean, I'm related with the shadow of pop culture, or waste which pop culture produced. You know. So I think that this is what I can offer to the people. Just slow down. You know, if you stop, then there is a promise that you will get something out of this. But I'm very often giving the example of that being in the contact with a work of art, mine work of art, is like reading the poetry, you know, and it means that not every day you can read poetry, you know, and not every day you can read Thomas Stern Eliot, you know, so this is something which is a little bit, but you need in your life some shade, and I think I'm producing this shade. So in the process of global warming, you know, I'm building the oasis, whereas if you stay a while, you see that there is a water coming from the ground, but very little, you know, like sometimes in the near, for example, Dead Sea, you can find the streams of water coming very little, but you don't see them in the first moment, but when you see that this is a fresh water next to the lake which is dying, which is killed by the salt, which is actually one of my major material as well, you know, but salt related with the wounds of the memory.
Yes. Great, thank you very much, Miroslav. I think you will probably all have some burning questions, so we'd like to open up to the audience, to you. So if anyone has a question for Miroslav, please raise your hand.
Okay, no burning
No?
questions. Yes.
Could you talk about material? Could you talk about salt and maybe just elaborate a bit on that?
About salt?
Well, you start to talk about salt and you use it a lot. So.
Yeah, I use a lot salt. Yeah.
Also wine.
Yeah, actually, it's the list of the materials which I'm using is very long. You know, sometimes I'm thinking that it would be easier to talk about materials which I'm not using. but
Yeah, you don't use bronze in your sculptures.
but when I was a student, yes, I used because when I finished academy, coming to the past, when I finished academy in '85, you know, I've been collecting clay in my home, believing that, because this is how I was taught, that the sculptor works in clay, and later I will cast it in plaster, and maybe I will cast it later in concrete, and this was my belief, you know, this was my experience. But when I left academy, I noticed that the materials are around, you know, and then I started to use anything which I had in my surroundings, you know. When I make the works which I sew from the jute bags, these were the bags which were used by my grandmother for vegetables, and so I understood how important is the truth of the material which I'm using, and the fact that that this is not the fake material, but this is a real material. So this belief in the material really got the new value to my works, you know. So often people ask me what is the difference between installation and sculpture, and I say that sculpture has its own body, you know, and the installation is just a temporary solution for the space. So.
But also your sculptures are in a way in line with the definition of sculpture, you know, something that raises off the ground, that you can walk around it, and that there's a volume to it. But then also in one of your interviews you say that you don't want to make any sculptures that are made of like shiny materials, or sculpture should be also something that is a bit more kind of accessible to the everyday, or like in the immediate outreach.
Yeah, but it's quite interesting because in today Guardian magazine on the internet, there is an article about the new museum opened in Switzerland, in Souche, which is near Davos, by a Polish collector.
Oh yes, she has a big collection as well.
Groszna Kulczyk.
Yes.
And actually I made the project for them, which is a revolving big mirror cylinder. I mean, made of polished steel. so I
Things change.
no, but what it is called Narcissus Souche, the word, because it's the Souche is the name. So I use the word Narcissus, and but actually, however, it's a mirrored surface of this. I mean, steel mirrored surface of the cylinder. But what is in this mirror is a beautiful old grotto in the kind of the small cave grotto in this Alps mountain. So actually, however, the material which I'm using is polished, but what is in this material has like 30 million years of history. This is the inside of the mountains.
Oh, yeah.
So this is not just the mirror surface. This is what is in the mirror surface and what is in the grotto. So this grotto is looking into this mirror surface. So it's not empty, you know. So this is quite interesting that even this polished mirror can carry the memory of the past. You know, so this can be also the materials which is not so innocent, you know, which is also carrying something in its image, because mirror is also carrying something, you know. Once we look at this, yes, it's carrying us. So in Souche, it's carrying also the grotto plus us.
The extensive history. I mean, just to give you a further context, this new museum is actually quite incredible because they've used quite a lot of resources to open the mountain. So like from the house, you actually kind of like walk in to the mountain, and some of the walls of the museum is, as Miroslav said, like 30,000 years old stones, like, or like slates. It's quite incredible. I didn't know that you had to work there, but it's very interesting.
Actually, if you go on the website of Guardian, this is the first illustration.
Great. I will definitely do that.
I'm just saying this in case, just because I say, okay, I agree that I never made the work in the shining material. And then you have a proof that, well...
What about this one? Yeah, but things change and people change.
Yeah, but I believe, you know, that as an artist, I mean, having this freedom of using materials, you know, and this is fantastic, you know, because I don't want to be, I mean, I'm using very different materials, you know. I didn't stop my practice on these old planks, you know, on the heating pillows, on the hair, which I used to make the ropes made of hair, my hair, my son's hair, the older one. Don't worry, Shimon.
Oh yeah, he's now.
I think he's hurt.
Did you say me?
So,
But what I also find interesting is that the title of your exhibition opening tomorrow is Random Access Memory, and it actually doesn't refer at all to something material. It refers to this data that computers collect and that forms a really, really elaborate digital memory that we all don't really comprehend. And so I wonder what layer does technology add for you in the collection of memory and of collective memory?
you know, we collect too many memories on our computers, but this is just to ask the title. It's always the part of the work for me. When I construct the title, it's always becoming as important as exhibition by itself. So I'm just asking myself, and asking myself, I also asking you, the ones who will experience this, about the presence of these words, of these three words, which we very easily swallow in the context of our computers. We just need more RAM for our computers. But when I'm saying look slowly into these three words: random, access, memory. And when you start to think about the possible access, or random access to the memory, what is a memory? What is your presence? What is your relation? How much of the memory we can use? What is important is the dimension of the memory. So I'm giving these questions to myself, and I, in this way, starting from having this digital shadow of RAM, I'm asking for the random access memory, which is very rarely used in the full versions. You know. So it's not RAM, it's just random access memory. But yeah, the titles are extremely important for me. I mean, if you look at the list of my solo shows, I think that there is a kind of the poetry when you can see how the title follows the title. For me, I'm working on the title. I'm having the new title. I'm thinking about the former title and the one before. Just because this is for me the kind of the poetry, which is my tombstone, which I'm writing on, you know, and the space between neighbors. Titles. This is very important pose, which when you said about Beckett, you know. So I'm looking for this relations between the titles. So they are always building something. Sometimes it's something which you don't understand immediately, but if you look closer, you will find maybe not logic, but the poetry.
So do you think if you didn't become an artist, would you be a poet? Or what would you do if you didn't become an artist?
Monumental mason.
That was your father's job, wasn't it? Masonry.
My grandfather did. Yeah, but I'm happy because happy being active with my hands, because it's something which when you can use your hands, it's good. And because for many years I thought that I don't have any artistic tradition in the family, but quite few years ago I found that what my grandfathers did, one who was a carpenter, the second who was a monumental mason, they were artists, you know, they were responsible for construction of the tombstone, for the construction of the house. So these were my artistic roots. So I'm happy that I'm continuing this a more weird way, but still something which you can trust.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Miroslav.
Thank you very much.
It was such a pleasure.